Welcome, everybody. My name is Paul Buitink, and today I have the honor again to discuss with Steve Keen what's going on in the world, and especially all these enormous amounts of debt that's being created because of COVID-19. How are we going to deal with that? Hi, Steve. Good to see you again.
Good to be here. I'll be there anyway.
Yeah, and you're based in Thailand at the moment, right?
Yeah, I was living in a town called Trang, which is in southern Thailand. And the motivation for moving here was coronavirus. I had four choices as to where I could stay: the UK, where I'm a resident; Australia, where I'm a citizen; Netherlands, where I have a flat, as you know; and Thailand, where my girlfriend is a citizen. And a combination of things, but looking at the numbers on COVID, and I just thought that Thailand's the only option. So we moved here. We arrived here one day before they started closing their border to tourists, and I intend being here for the duration now.
Well, I think it sounds like the perfect place to stay for now. And you intend to stay there until when?
Well, until this crisis ends, because, I mean, just to give you an idea of what it's like, I think you've got over 40,000 cases in the Netherlands now?
Yeah, something like that. I don't follow it on a daily basis anymore, to be honest.
Yeah, well, there's 3,000 cases in Thailand.
Yeah.
They just cracked 3,000. You're getting about between 100 and 200 new cases a day. Thailand has between 1 and 10. There's much more successful social distancing over here. You can find things like alcohol very easily. Masks are everywhere. They were prepared for a crisis like this in a way that the West wasn't, and they've gone for actual extermination of the virus, not this crazy idea of herd immunity. So I wanted to minimise my chances of getting the disease, and I've ended up in a province where there has not been a new case now for 3 weeks, and there would be a total of 7 cases in a province of 700,000 people. So 1 in 100,000 incidents versus about 1 in 500 in most of Europe. So yeah, I'll stay here until there's a vaccine.
Well, it sounds like a safe place, and I'm also curious to understand what Thailand is doing with regards to the economy. But I think it's better for now, at least, to focus on a few of the other markets and to start with the US, because the situation in the US is quite tough, to be honest. If you look at the number of jobless claims, unemployment is now above 20%. I believe private debt stands at more than 14 trillion. A lot of people are not able to pay their bills at the moment. You've been saying it for a long time that at some point Jubilee or debt forgiveness is needed, just like in biblical times. Do more people now follow your line of thinking? Do you see it's becoming more of a solution proposed by mainstream economists as well?
To some extent, yeah. I mean, to give people a bit of a background here, I first proposed the idea of a modern debt jubilee about a decade ago, because I said what actually caused the financial crisis was too much private debt, and what got us into that situation partially was governments trying to actually run a surplus, which literally directly causes the private sector to have an identical deficit. This is one of the accounting points of modern monetary theory. And given the fact that you're putting the private sector into effective deficit, what do? They go and borrow money from banks and speculate on rising house prices, which is what gave us those enormous bubbles back up to 2007. And we now have a level of private debt that is actually unprecedented in the history of capitalism, and possibly history of humanity. And that's what is restricting people from spending. And yet you get people saying, "Oh, we shouldn't let debtors off their debt. That's really, a moral hazard. They'll only go and do it again." And my argument, which is very consistent with Michael Hudson and a few other people who specialise in the role of debt, is we can use the government's money creation capability to not to cancel debt alone, but to offset the debt with money created by the government sector. So what you do is you create a large amount of fiat money to replace an identical amount of credit money. And with that, you can get rid of the debt burden and enable the economy to start working again. Until we do it, it simply won't happen. I thought there was zero chance of the idea of it being implemented, so I really haven't worked on it a great deal since 2012. But along comes coronavirus, and now it's becoming obvious even to mainstream economists that what is likely to happen is a financial crisis, because suddenly people haven't got the cash flow to repay their ordinary obligations like mortgages and rent. And in that situation, there could be an enormous financial crisis unless we do something. So they're now talking about in various forms of the debt jubilee that I've been arguing for a decade.
Yeah, so the main difference then between a modern debt jubilee and one from biblical times is that back in the day, the debts were just canceled because, of course, there were just a few rulers who owned all the debt, so it was easier to just cancel them. But in modern times, it's a very intricate web of debtors and creditors and balance sheets. So if you start canceling consumer debt, then the banks get into trouble, and then you will have a chain of bankruptcies and defaults, which possibly could completely melt down the system. So I guess that's the main difference between back in the day and modern day, is that you don't cancel the debt, but you're just going to offset them with another type of money, namely money issued by the state.
If you go back and look at them, Michael Hudson knows far more about this stuff than I do, but if you look at what happened with debt jubilees in the ancient times, they were restricted to household debt. So commercial debt was not abolished, and the idea was anybody who borrowing money for a commercial venture normally borrows with an eye of what they expect to earn out of it. So commercial debts weren't cancelled, but a lot of household debt was apparently run up in mead halls and alcohol places, and actually in debt to the publican fundamentally, and then you'd become a debt slave to pay off the debt. And when you became a debt slave, you could no longer be recruited for the army. So the actual survival of the empire was threatened by the fact that you were in debt. So it was given the choice between losing the empire and killing a few creditors. You can guess which one the emperors normally chose. And then it became instituted as a regular thing that every 49 years, I think it was, or every change of emperor, this is in the Sumerian Empire, first of all, there'd be a debt jubilee which would free all the debt slaves. And that became built into what people expected about the nature of the society. Now, of course, as you say, we have people who are savers and people who are borrowers, neither of whom are lenders. And this is the point which is important about modern monetary theory and thinking in terms of credit. Banks create the debt. Banks then give the money to debtors when they create that debt. The debtors then spend it. It'll end up being distributed throughout. The money is distributed through different people's accounts. The debt is still held by the debtors. If you then simply abolish the debt, you'd crash the whole financial system.
Exactly.
So this is to say, let's use the government's money creation capability to give everybody an identical injection and enable that. To say, if you get the money and you're in debt, then you must pay your debt down, or you have a debt offset. If you're not in debt, you get a cash injection, and that could be used. If you don't want to actually increase the amount of money in circulation of the real economy, you could require that money was used to buy corporate shares, where those corporate shares would have to be used to cancel corporate debt. And that would then mean you could reduce both household debt and corporate debt without changing the amount of money in the economy, and enable a huge reduction in the debt burden, which would actually probably give a stimulus to the economy by people being more willing to spend, because at the moment people are hoarding to try to pay their debts back. So that's the basic concept. It doesn't actually, it maintained the effective solvency of the banks. They wouldn't have as much liquidity. They wouldn't have as much income earning assets. But the banks would still have the same positive equity coming out of it. So it's feasible to do it without destroying the financial system. Whereas if you just abolish the debt, you destroy the financial system.
Yeah. So if I would be a consumer without debt, I would receive then government money. But do I would receive that then in a government wallet, or is that channeled through the bank?
That's one thing which depends upon your monetary structure. So I originally proposed it when I was in Australia. And if you're in Australia, everybody gets a tax return. Everybody has an account linked to their taxes at their private bank. The government, the Treasury knows your bank account, and your tax refund or your tax bill is paid through that account. So back in 2008, it was quite simple for the Rudd Labor government then to say, we're going to give everybody a $1,000 rebate, as they called it. So every bank account got $1,000. Now in the UK, most people don't pay tax. They pay tax as they go. They don't have a tax return. So it's not feasible. So I've been in favour of creating central bank digital currencies, not because I want to abolish cash by any means. I just don't trust central banks with the abolition of cash. But if you did that, everybody would have an account at the central bank. And then the government could easily put an injection of money into your account at the central bank and control how that money was spent. So if you were in debt, the money would be offset against your debts. If you weren't in debt, then you could be required to use that money to buy corporate shares. That's why I prefer to see central bank digital currencies created. But if you don't have that, then if you do have a link between people's bank accounts and how they pay tax, then the government can make an injection directly into private bank accounts.
Yeah, and maybe you can have a separated account with your bank that is not part of the ordinary the ordinary balance sheet of a bank, or at least it's segregated and it cannot be used in other ways, something like that. And so you can easily see what's standard bank money and government money through the bank.
Yeah, that'd be quite. We can do it electronically these days in a way that was never possible, say, 80 years ago during the Great Depression. However, one thing which was done with the bank holidays back in America at that time was actually to consolidate debt and write debt off and move deposits from a failing bank to a successful bank. And that was a major part of why we got through the Great Depression. So we have done something similar in the recent past, but of course, the financial sector is the main group that would resist that. The reason that coronavirus gives us an opportunity is that I think the banks themselves realise that if people can't pay their mortgages and they can't pay their rent, then there could be a chain reaction of bankruptcies that also sends the banks bankrupt. And now they're worried enough to be thinking, well, maybe we should agree to something like this, whereas in the past we would have resisted it.
Yeah, because on their balance sheet, they would just swap all these mortgages and car loans for government assets, basically, for something that they have with the central bank reserves, I guess.
Yeah,
what they're going to have. Yeah.
If you say you owed a debt, let's say you owed a debt of €100,000 to your bank, and that the amount of money, let's say the amount per person was €100,000, which is probably more than I'm thinking of, but just give an easy example, then the bank would have an asset of $100,000 of the debt you owe to the bank, which was a commitment for future payment. But they knew that there's no possibility you would actually fail in that, and therefore they might lose 30% or 40% of that. With this rescue, they'd get $100,000 in government-created money, and that would mean that their equity would be maintained. Whereas if your situation, if you went from being able to having a €100,000 debt, which you would be unable to service, so you'd have to sell whatever property you'd bought with it, and then by selling it, there'd be a loss and all those sorts of things. The bank might find itself getting €50,000, so it loses 50,000. It takes a hit on its equity, it could go bankrupt. So it's
in a way, it's also a bailout for the banks. Then the banks are just as much bailed out via this mechanism as are ordinary consumers.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and by sort of forcing people to also buy corporate shares, you are trying to keep inflation in check then, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, if you had an enormous creation of money, like, looking at the levels of debt around the world, I mean, the Netherlands has an enormous level of corporate debt, about 1.6 times GDP. Your household debt's about 100% of GDP. If you actually injected that much money into the economy in one go, of course you'd cause an inflationary spurge. So the idea is if you could cancel, like if you injected 100% of GDP in 1 year in this scheme, which is more than I would consider doing first time round, but if you did do that, then if say half of that money went to people in debt and half went to those who didn't have debt, you'd have a 50% of GDP increase in cash in the hands of people who want to spend, which of course would cause a huge surge in spending. But if you said, well, instead, 80% of that must be used to buy corporate shares, and therefore you reduce corporate debt by 40% of GDP and put a 10% stimulus in, that's much smaller. You could even say, well, in the Netherlands case, 100% of the money must be used to buy corporate shares. And what you would do then is partially increase the level of the democratic content of share ownership, because it'd be across the entire country. And you'd also reduce the extent to which quantitative easing, which central banks have practiced for the last decade, has actually boosted share prices, which has made the rich richer and left the poor in the lurch. This would be a way of resettling that democratic deficit that the central banks pushed us into by the QE they actually practiced.
Yeah, so in that way, consumers are helped, banks are saved, corporates also see a benefit because they have too much debt and some of it will be converted in shares. But then we have still a big problem with SME. Most small businesses are struggling at the moment, especially especially restaurants and bars and shops in tourism. How are they going to benefit, or is it also possible, in your view, that they should get some of the helicopter money as well?
Yeah, they could also get some of the helicopter money too. I mean, it's quite possible to give a cash injection based on the size of the corporation. So individuals would be getting, as households, every household account would get the same amount of money. If you could leave large corporates out of it, but say SMEs would get, say, the same amount of money. You could have you could actually set it up in such a way that SMEs with an account backing of, or say an overdraft limit of, say, between 100,000 and $1 million, could get $500,000. These are various ways you could actually do it, because we do have data and we do have electronic financial systems. So it is feasible to extend it to SMEs as well, not large corporates, obviously, but you could extend it to SMEs. And that would enable the small businesses to keep on functioning. Whereas at the moment, as we know, anybody in entertainment and tourism is basically destroyed by the coronavirus.
Yeah, and then the mortgages, they would go from the commercial bank balance sheet to the central bank balance sheet.
Not necessarily.
Or they would be paid off completely.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you look at what's actually going on with central banks create money, every time a bank creates money, it's an accounting operation. So if you have a private bank which creates a loan, creates new debt for a borrower, let's say they create $1 million in euro for somebody to buy an expensive property in Amsterdam, then they create $1 million on their asset side, and they create $1 million on the liabilities, on €1 million on the liability side, which goes into the buyer's account, and then the buyer transfers that €1 million to the seller, and you have a €1 million increase in the seller's account. When a central bank does it, it simply says, normally to a financial institution, we're going to buy $1 billion worth of bonds off you. So you transfer the ownership of $1 billion worth of bonds, which goes on the central bank's asset side, and we'll put $1 billion into your bank account at the central bank, which increases the liability side. Now, they could equally do what has been done by the Central Bank of England, the Bank of England. They allow Scottish banks to create what they call the Scottish pound, which is one-for-one equivalent to the British pound, but issued by banks like Clydesdale Bank and Royal Bank of Scotland and so on. And for every $100 million pounds worth of those notes in circulation, the Bank of England creates a £100 million note they call a Titan, which stays inside Threadneedle Street. If you tried to go shopping with it, if you broke into the bank and stole it and tried to go shopping and buy a local Lamborghini distributorship, you'd be arrested. Nobody would accept it. It's just a piece of paper.
It's fairy dust. It's nothing.
It's fairy dust, yeah.
But they might as well run up a negative equity. It's just all accounting bullshit. They can just run up a negative equity, right?
And that's right, because central banks can operate with negative equity. There's a paper by, I think another guy called Paul Bolat, who's at the Bank of England. He and a few research colleagues wrote a paper up saying central banks can operate with negative equity. Now, that's one thing a private bank cannot do. A private bank with negative equity is by definition bankrupt. But a central bank, because it's backed by the entire country effectively, its equity doesn't really matter. So they've done this trick with the Scottish notes, and they could do exactly the same thing with the debt jubilee.
But is then, in order to sort of create the illusion of solvency in order for the market to keep on having faith in the pound, or why not just be honest and say, look, this is all fairy dust, and we might as well just write it off, this Titan, and show that we have negative equity?
Well, I think in fact what they're doing is doing the fairy dust and just saying that we want to pretend. They want to. You've got to keep your assets and liabilities in balance. The fundamental. You can't run a bank and violate what's called the fundamental law of accounting: assets minus liabilities minus equity equals zero. What central banks, of course, they can have negative equity there and still balance the entire thing. But it's just neat and tidy to say we're going to create this fictional equity of 100 million over here, and this is fictional asset we've created concerning an equity, and therefore we don't fall into negative equity. But it is an accounting trick, and money fundamentally is accounting, and that's why people like me, I get so frustrated when I hear people say, how are we going to pay for it? you write two numbers in a balance sheet. That's how you pay for it.
If you are the sovereign issuer of money, of course, it's in the Eurozone, it's a bit more difficult, as we've seen over the past
You guys have a problem. Yeah, that's one of the many reasons I was in favour of abolishing the euro and going back to national currencies.
Okay, let's discuss that too. I think you also brought a chart, right? I enabled screen sharing now, so I think you should be able to pull it up.
Okay, that's because I wanted to show people. I mean, I know that this is going to sound to people an outrageous set of ideas and so on and so forth, but they need to get an idea of what's going on in the economy and why we have to do something about it. This is the velocity of M2 money, the rate at which money in check accounts and savings accounts turns over on an annual basis. And you can see that this is it's a measured statistic and it's got problems with it. I'm not going to say otherwise, but I want to see a very interesting trend that's happened to it. For a long time, it ran between about 1.7 and 1.9 times GDP. Then we had the period of what was called the Great Moderation, and that actually rose quite dramatically. That's actually really representing the asset bubble that happened back in the 1990 to 2000 period. Then you had the decline, and now look what's happened to it. It's down about 1.4. Now, since the coronavirus has hit, it's plunging. So what's going on here clearly is people spending much, much less money than they were doing beforehand, which is sort of a hoarding effect. But at the same time, what's happening to loans? And this is really showing, this is dramatic. I only saw this a couple of days ago. Commercial industrial loans were rising at sort of not an unexpected rate in America. And then you get to here, and that's what's happened. They've been pushed into having to borrow to remain solvent. So they're accessing the credit lines.
And also big corporates that out of prudence, just used all the facilities they had with their banks in order to have enough cash to survive the crisis, right? So
that's $500 billion. To keep on going. So that's going to turn up on their debt books at some point. And that's an increase in the level of private debt compared to GDP. Now, we know GDP is plunging right now. And this is the really scary thing. This is long-term look at the level of debt and credit in the United States going back right back to 1830. So this is looking at the level of private debt. That's the red line. That's the percentage of GDP. That's 50, 100%, 150 over here. You can see, first of all, that the level of private debt at the global financial crisis was greater as a percentage of GDP than the Great Depression. Even with the deleveraging that occurred after the crisis, you've still got a level of debt that's greater than the Great Depression. And each time there's been a serious crisis in America, it's been negative credit. This is the blue line is the rate of change of private debt that I call credit. And that it's minus 10% of GDP during the worst downturns that America has had. Now, what we're likely to see after the initial stage of people borrowing money, accessing credit lines to increase their leverage to get cash flow so they can pay their commitments for a short while, that might cause this to be positive for a while, but it's going to go massively negative while the ratio might rise because, notice here, the ratio is rising while the amount of debt is falling. And what's going on there is GDP fell by 20 or 30% as people paid their debt down by 10%. Now, we saw what's just happening in America right now. The level of GDP might fall by 40% during this crisis. So a 40% fall in GDP, no change in the level of nominal debt, you're going to get a dramatic increase in the debt ratio, and you're already on the verge of bankruptcy. And that to me is really, we simply have to do something to stop that happening after the crisis. Otherwise, we'll have a financial crisis following on from the health crisis.
Yeah, and some time ago you wrote, of course, this book, Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis? And you just answered the question. We are in it, and there's no way to avoid it. The only thing we can do is to try to soften it, and maybe Jubilee would be a right way forward. But do you think that would be such a dramatic change that it would also lead to a completely new financial system afterwards? Because it almost seems like it's such a big step that it seems impossible that we continue like we've been doing over the past decades with all this debt buildup, that we need to also progress towards a better system afterwards, a more sustainable system.
I think don't underestimate the capacity of the financial sector to try to push us back into the old pattern. So, yeah. I mean, the financial sector, and that's again that data I showed you. If you look at just remember the increase in private debt from the end of the Second World War forward. Back in the 1950s, private debt in America was about 30% of GDP. And at that level, the finance sector was tamed. You had bankers went to jail during the Great Depression. You had bank holidays and forced bank holidays done by Roosevelt and so on. The power of the bankers was broken by the Great Depression and the Second World War. And in the aftermath, they were the servants of the industrial sector. You had an enormous amount of credit being created for industrial innovation and consumption and so on. That was the golden age of capitalism. Now, fast forward to where we are now, the level of debt is 5 times what it was compared to GDP back then. The finance sector is dominant, it rules everything. And politicians, if they talk to anybody outside a political circle, they talk to people in finance, they're going to be following the arguments. We've got to re-establish everything and get the finance sector back in control again. That'd be the worst thing we can do. Now, it's still possible we'll get the worst thing, but I think this is, as you say, a time for a new financial architecture where we drastically reduce the power of the financial sector, provide the money for people get money to people for spending and to entrepreneurs for innovation, and finance, trying to get a green revolution on this planet before we destroy it entirely. That's what I'd like us to go for, but I'm sure the finance sector will campaign for a return to business as usual after the crisis is over.
Yeah, and in the States, we've seen already quite a few lenders that have offered a few months of relief that you don't have to pay, and this is already, of course, a sign of desperation if they allow millions of people not to pay for many months. But of course, that will only delay the problem, and the problem will only be bigger after a few months. Because I'm sure interest rates or interest charges, they will continue, and debt will not be any smaller. Well, like you say, GDP is contracting. So what if we don't go for a Jubilee? What would be the alternative then? What kind of situation will we end up in then?
Oh, I think we'll see people going bankrupt on a massive scale because, as you say, the so-called debt repayment holidays, they're giving a just period where they say you don't have to pay the debt. We're going to continue recording that you owe that debt and you haven't paid it. So your debt's going to compound doubly. First of all, because money you haven't paid while you can't pay it during the coronavirus will be added to the amount that you currently owe. They'll probably charge interest on top of that as well. So it'll compound at a super exponential rate. You might find people coming out of the crisis with a debt level 10% of GDP higher than they went into it, when GDP itself has collapsed on top of that. So that's going to amplify it once more. Yeah, you can have people saying, you're asking me to pay my mortgage, you're asking me to pay my rent, I've got no money left in my bank account, I haven't got a job, here are my keys, the old jingle mail effect again, and you could have a collapse in the American financial system once more.
So it would be either Jubilee or meltdown of the system.
I think that's pretty much, yeah.
With depression-like figures, high unemployment, and like a lost decade, basically.
Yeah, and political turmoil over it, because this crisis has been so much faster than the last one. And this time people can't blame themselves for, borrowing too much money to buy the house. There was a certain amount of guilt that was pulled on households for, mum and dad made the terrible mistake of agreeing to a loan contract put forward by a bank which has 200 economics PhDs and 300 lawyers drafting it, and mum and dad blame themselves for signing the deal rather than saying, isn't there something suspect about a bank offering this much money to us? It's the banks that were really at fault, not the individuals, but the individuals blamed themselves. And I think that put a lid on how much revolting there was, how much revolt actually happened after the crisis. This time around, people are going to say, we were screwed. We didn't want to stay home. We had to stay home. No, we're not going to put up with it. And maybe much more political turmoil after this than there was after the 2008 crisis.
But at the same time, Steve, when I see these queues for people getting food packages because they have no savings, but they still drive big pickups that they lease from as well. So there's of course still responsibility people also need to take themselves. That instead of trying to get the biggest car and try to save some money instead.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got a consumer-driven society, and we're now realising in lockdown how much of that was garbage, and that we also to me I see coronavirus as just the very first major global phenomenon of climate change. People reduce climate change to just global warming. It's far more than that. We're putting an enormous amount of pressure on the biosphere, and that's one reason why these diseases evolve in the human species. There's no point in them evolving in any other predator because the numbers of all of the predators are falling. The only predator whose numbers are increasing are humans. And the only predator to hop on planes and fly somewhere else are humans. So in that basis, we're just saying to pathogens, hey, why not evolve in the human species? Much better prospects than evolving in lions or tigers. And other forms of pressure we're putting on the environment as well, plastic pollution, chemical pollution, waste, unprocessable wastes, taking over the wild kingdom, destroying forests, etc., etc. All this stuff is putting enormous pressure on the biosphere, and we're going to see many more events, not qualitatively like the coronavirus, but having an impact upon the sustainability of our society, like the coronavirus. We're going to have to go backwards dramatically. So I'm not in favour of monetary austerity, but I think we're going to have to practice a large amount of physical austerity in the next decade if we're going to have any chance to survive as a civilization.
Yeah, in that sense, it's the best wake-up call that we could have had. What is your view then that it might also lead to too much power with the government? Because I, for one, am very suspicious always when it comes to power in general. When it's big corporates, of course, you want to be careful, but also big government can be a scary prospect. And by giving the government that much power to create and allocate money, don't you then bring in all sorts of other risk factors and creating other problems?
I think we're going to have a whole lot of that, frankly, because we've let the private sector rip for too long, and saying that the government's role is to let the private sector rip, and that would have worked if we were still living in what William Baumol decades ago called cowboy capitalism, where you have wide open spaces. Humans are a very small part of the ecological footprint, and you can expand as much as you like and don't need to worry about waste. We're now living in what he called spaceship capitalism, and there we're incredibly crowded. We're putting enormous demands on the spaceship, and we're dumping a lot of waste in the spaceship as well. In that situation, we're going to have to go backwards, and capitalism doesn't go backwards voluntarily. So I can see a real increase in state power inevitably out of this, and in fact, to some degree, necessarily out of it. Whether we'll do it intelligently or not, I very much doubt it. I can see a lot of fascist elements coming into it as well. But I think, yeah, we're going to see increase in state whether we want it or not, and it's because we let the private sector rip too much for the last 50 to 100 years.
Yeah, in cahoots with the government, of course. It's always been double play.
Now we're going to have to go the other way. But again, the same sort of cahoots behaviour is likely to continue as well, of course.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind to see a few experiments across the world. So maybe one country could try your solution. Another country could completely let people decide whatever currency they want to use. Yet another country can try to proceed the same way as now, just to see how these different experiments would lead to different outcomes. That would be very interesting for me to see.
I think we're actually seeing that in the coronavirus, funnily enough. I mean, whether Europe has done it intentionally or not, Europe is closely following the Swedish model. Even though you say not being Swedish, you're still being pretty Swedish. And whereas Asia has followed the what's called the End Coronavirus model put forward by Benir Yarbam. I highly recommend looking at that page called endcoronavirus.org.
Yeah,
and he
crush the
argued
curve,
in favour
right?
Crush the curve. He's talking in favour of extermination And it looks like a lot of Asia, Australia and New Zealand, and a small handful of other countries are going to exterminate the virus. So in that world, you're going to have a two-part world, one part without the virus and the other part with. Now, that itself is a pretty crazy social experiment. I don't think anybody's going to abolish money. Okay, I think, in fact, this strengthens fiat money because if you actually, for example, said, well, let's go across to Bitcoin now, you'd be rewarding the people who gambled on Bitcoin for something they had absolutely no anticipation of, which was this virus.
With foresight. And not the virus, of course, but more in general, like people bought Bitcoin because they didn't like the existing monetary order.
Yeah, but reasons. I mean, how many transactions can Bitcoin handle a second right now? Were you back down to, what are we down to, 3?
Now, of course, it's all about the lightning and trying to get a second layer in place.
Yeah. Good timing. I think lightning's been hit by a thunderbolt. This whole idea that we can have an alternative monetary system, to me, this crisis strengthens fiat money systems. You might use Bitcoin type currencies as a form of speculation and storage, but it's not used for transactions. And what we're likely to see, I think, is to some extent a movement towards a universal basic income, which I think is a good idea out of this crisis as well. And in that world, it might be digitally distributed, but it won't be a speculative currency in the way that Bitcoin has been.
No. Well, let's see. I sure hope to see 1,000 flowers bloom and see what works best. But I'm very sympathetic to the whole idea of a Jubilee, because I also see how unsustainable the current private debt load is. So something has to be done about it, otherwise it comes all crashing down. Final topic briefly, because I know you've been, of course, living in Amsterdam as well, and the euro is something you have been, of course, diagnosing for a long time what's wrong with the euro, and I think you're quite a proponent for just going back to national currencies, right?
And I think that again, I mean, particularly the way Italy was treated during the crisis by Germany, so much for European solidarity, and it showed that the euro is there to stop things happening, not to let things happen, and you need to let things happen right now. So to me, it was part of the paralysis of Europe that has meant Europe has had such a bad performance on the coronavirus. If the crazy thing is, the worst countries in the world are America, UK, and Europe, whereas the best countries in the world and the whole thing are the Asian countries. Now, they haven't got any. They've all got their own national currencies. They've all got strong national governments. They've all decided to provide money to let people continue operating. It's intriguing the extent to which Europe and America have failed in this crisis. There's much more ideology in America and Europe than there is in Asia. There's just acceptance of a strong role for a state here, and no nonsense like trying to join China and Japan into a common currency area. And they're doing much, much better. So I think the real interesting experiment is countries that have always had some degree of a belief in a strong state versus the libertarian hang-ups of Europe and America.
So, but if a breakup of the euro is inevitable, would a country then need to start preparing already by, for example, trying to get rid of all euro-denominated assets, like, for example, pension funds in Holland? They own huge chunks of euro assets, like bonds of other countries, for example. Would they be wise then to start maybe secretly divesting these assets and increase their euro debt, because that will in the future be worthless? How should you plan for a breakup as a smart country?
I think that one of the dangers is these things may never happen. I mean, I thought the euro should break up during the financial crisis, and it kept on going. So I wouldn't be advising anybody to take that particular gamble on. But if Italy decides to, it's had enough of the euro, Italy suffered more than any other country, I think, in terms of the damaging impact of the euro on it. If they simply decide, right, we're writing off all our debts tomorrow, every bank account in Italy is now a new lira, and there's no, we have no euro debts to the rest of the world. You know, they could
so
do
if that's
Italy
going to
very
happen,
well.
it makes sense not to have any Italian bonds, for
Yeah,
example. So you have
but
to
at
then.
but then the ECB will probably back those bonds anyway. I mean, it's back to accounting. You know, when before a crisis hits, all these things are impossible. When a crisis hits, all these things happen. So, you know, I'm skeptical about the extent that they've let, you know, European bondholders fail. They'd probably go in and rescue them again. And by rescuing them, they'd validate the approach to money that people like myself have had for the last 50 years and they've said is wrong. They'd validate it in one stroke.
Yeah. So a Jubilee would also be almost impossible then in Europe to get to get everyone on the same page.
Yeah,
impossible.
Yeah, I think so. Again, that's another reason against the euro.
That's sobering. I should get the hell out of here. Join you in Thailand, Steve.
Yeah, well, a bit too late. I got here one day before they started to close the border to tourists, so I'm sorry, but you can't join me. Not until after the virus is over anyway.
Okay. Well, it's very inspiring again to talk to you, Steve. Thanks so much for making time available. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Oh, just, I mean, a major thing I've been doing in research, as you know, in the last year rather, is focusing on climate change and the absolutely appalling garbage that has been pumped out by Richard Toll, William Nordhaus, and all these moronic neoclassical mainstream economists. I'd like people to check out my Patreon page, which is normally most of the articles there are free. You don't have to be a patron to read them. As I try to pull apart this stuff and say why they've got us into a serious crisis, of which this is just the first taste, and we have to get rid of the bastards, kick them out of positions of authority, so we have any chance to have a survivable planet for the next decade. That's my main message. And for the meantime, I'll be pumping it out on my Patreon page.
It's patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen, right?
That's the one. Yep.
Yeah, I'll put it also in the show notes. Great. Well, I advise everyone to take a look and follow and support Steve online and also financially. Thanks again, Steve, and good luck there. Enjoy your time in Thailand.
Thank you.
And hopefully next time in Holland, once the crisis is over, we can
maybe in 2022.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Steve.